My name is Christina Smith, and I'm a PhD student in the Department of Archaeology at Durham, getting to study with David Petts and Sarah Semple. My project is affiliated with the Corpus of Anglo-Saxon Stone Sculpture, otherwise known as CAS, and in my spare time, I enjoy keeping CAS's Twitter account active. So as a short plug, you can follow us on @AS_Corpus if you want your daily dose of armchair early medieval sculpture.
A huge time pressure to create this treatment.
Right.
Closer to turning hope for
This paper focuses on context, as is my entire PhD. Tonight, I make no aim to offer an exhaustive survey of early medieval high crosses in County Durham and Northumberland, as A, that might put some of you to sleep, and B, my list runs some 264 entries long. Nor am I so much interested in what is carved onto the crosses, that is iconography, although that's indeed an integral part of sculpture's story. I've listed here a roadmap for the next 40 or so minutes, beginning with a brief introduction to form and variation. What is a high cross and what forms does it take in this region? We then head into a look at high cross assemblages across Durham and Northumberland and ask what these sculpture groupings might tell us about the communities which invested in them at certain moments of time. From here, we examine a couple of primary archaeological contexts, that is, high crosses believed to be in situ. At this time, I'll also touch lightly on the percentage of fragments which have actually been found in excavation, and the results might surprise you. And lastly, we end with a discussion of reuse contexts and compare this with what we find directly to the west in Cumbria. And now an aside before we begin. You'll note that during this paper, I'll usually employ the adjective early medieval rather than Anglo-Saxon or Anglian. This is done intentionally and in an effort to encompass the many different and often overlapping traditions which made their mark on this region in the period between 8600 to 1100. Boiling an artifact down to a reductive ethnic label can take away from its complexity and the myriad cultural influences brought to bear on its production, use, and reuse. We turn now, to this end, we can't forget that Northeast England was, in the early medieval period, intimately connected to southern Scotland, and that the Anglo-Scottish border was non-existent. Most of the sculpture images on this slide are from high cross fragments in southeast Scotland, here defined as that area north of the Tweed and south of the Forth. This region was indeed part of the Kingdom of Northumbria at its height, and the high crosses here reflect a range of influence, not just from a south up or Anglian direction. Some fine examples include the fragments at Moreham, Coldingham, Abercorn, and Jedburgh. We turn now to our first topic, form and variation. I'm defining a high cross as a freestanding cruciform stone sculpture, which can be either monolithic or, as is more commonly the case in Durham and Northumberland, composite. They are usually free armed, marking them out from cross slabs, although certain freestanding cross types prove an exception to this definition. And here I'm thinking of wheel-headed or disc-headed crosses familiar in the west of Britain, places like southwest Scotland, Cornwall, Wales, and the Isle of Man. Freestanding ringed crosses, so common to Argyll, are also included in this definition. As a class of monument, high crosses are found the length and breadth of Britain over a period of 500 or so years, from Cardinham and Corwin in the south to Canna in the north. This slide shows 4 upstanding high crosses from Kirkhowl and Hyjock, Nevern, and Islay. England, Wales, and Scotland are all represented by this transnational and indeed at times transitional class of monuments. For context, there are give or take some 550 fragments of surviving early medieval sculpture from County Durham and Northumberland. Fragments that are almost certainly from high crosses constitute about 41% of surviving sculpture. If we added fragments that are questionably from high crosses, the number comes close to 50%, and that's a conservative estimate. The region also has a rather substantial assemblage of architectural sculpture. The 3 major textually attested 7th century monastic sites at Hexham, Wearmouth, and Jarrow provide a combined 50 architectural fragments on their own. And at Hexham and Jarrow, we even see designs from architectural sculpture being translated onto freestanding crosses. Expanding this to the greater north, we have the following broad brushstroke statistics. And yes, I know I haven't included Cheshire and Lancashire within the greater north, but that's only for the sake of time and because the data here already reflects the point that I want to make. In southeast Scotland, nearly 1 in 2 surviving fragments comes from a high cross. In northwest England, that number goes up to 60%, meaning over half of all surviving early medieval sculpture in the region comes from high crosses. In North Yorkshire, York, and Eastern Yorkshire, the percentage of fragments which are from high crosses sits at about 50 to 55%, and in Western Yorkshire, the number is back up to 60%. The tallies on this slide don't include Southwest Scotland, as I've noted, but there we have nearly 4 times the amount of high cross fragments than in Southeast Scotland. Now, of course, this number depends on how we define a high cross. For example, if wheel-headed crosses with their shorter height and thin slab-like proportions are included, but that's a topic for another paper. So in all, we're seeing that for regions in Northern England and Southern Scotland, at least 1 in 2 surviving early medieval sculpture fragments comes from a high cross. And again, for context, we don't see anywhere near these high cross percentages in the Midlands or Southern England. The following pie chart makes that clear. 51% of extant fragments from across the whole of Northwest and Northeast England come from high crosses. And again, that number only rises if we include the questionable cases. So at this point, you might be asking, why is this woman obsessed with high crosses, let alone any sort of sculpture fragment? And that's fair. The reason is this: for many Northern English and Southern Scottish sites, let alone a great deal of locations across Britain, a single piece of extant sculpture is our only archaeological evidence of pre-12th century activity at that site. Evidently, excavation provides further insight, but for many areas, a dearth of archaeological excavation, plus a lack of historical, and by this I mean textual sources, means that we simply have to rely on the sculpture record. And high crosses undoubtedly constitute a particularly exceptional type of sculpture. Not only do they reflect a degree of economic investment and artistic skill arguably greater than that needed for other sculpture forms, but their presence as a freestanding post-Roman sculpture in the round makes these British monuments and their Irish counterparts unique in the wider Northern European landscape. High crosses are not just expressions of Christian faith. They are statements in stone delineating political allegiance, changing patronage, and conversation with a wider insular and indeed continental world. I include a small graphic showing locations of high crosses in Ireland to make the following point. There are more high cross fragments in Northern England than there are in the whole of Ireland. Now, I realize that in saying this, I must clarify something. Yes, the Irish high crosses are on the whole much better preserved and complete, and for the most part still upstanding. We can't say the same of our fragmentary British high crosses, but much of that can be explained by the iconoclasm of the Reformation, and even earlier during the Norman period. Before we look into form and variation, it might be helpful to have an idea of where our sites with high cross fragments are located. You'll note both an inland distribution along valleys, some river valleys, as well as an important coastal stretch at sites from around the River Tees all the way up to the River Tweed. Coastal sites are particularly important for this maritime region, and, as in Southeast Scotland, seem to be home to some of the earliest high crosses. This seems fairly evident when one considers that the initial investment in high crosses within early medieval Britain comes from monastic establishments, a great deal of which were in coastal locations. And as another point of reference, I've included a simple bar chart detailing the chronological distribution of high cross fragments in the Northeast. Mind you, this is almost entirely based off of stylistic and iconographic analysis, which can, with all due respect to any art historians in the room, all too easily become circular. You date something off of something else, so what happens if you change or challenge the initial dated object? Another problem is that this type of art historical chronology often privileges those monuments with figural carving, human or animal forms. And as you'll see in a moment, only about a third of high cross fragments in this region actually have figural carving, and only half within that is human figuration. I just want you to keep this issue of chronology in mind as we progress through the following slides. So what forms does a high cross take in Durham and Northumberland? The short answer is a great many. Now, I'm not going to go into cast terminology, whereby a crosshead is of type A9 or a cross shaft is type H, meaning it's a collared cross shaft. Though it's helpful for regional classification, and indeed Professor Rosemary Cramp's 1984 Grammar of Anglo-Saxon Ornament was devised specifically for this region. It can also be restrictive when taking on cross-border comparisons. This slide shows the range of shapes and sizes a freestanding crosshead can take in Northeast England, with largest crossheads on the left to smallest on the right. Measurements are in metrics, so you have height, width, and depth, as I've noted on the slide. I'm especially interested in high cross arm span or width, which I've also included in inches for the non-metric trained amongst us, namely most Americans like myself. What we immediately notice is that there's a great range, from the wider dominating arm span of Durham and Lindisfarne crosses, albeit of stylistically later date, and they come close to about 3 feet in length, to the delicate curvature of the upper arm of a smaller ringed crosshead from Greetham, possibly about 1.5 feet in width, with what would have probably been a slab-like shaft. It is one of a very few surviving ringed crossheads from Durham and Northumberland. I've just now commented on the wider dominating arm span of late Durham and Lindisfarne crosses, but I must refine what I've said. There are no early surviving crossheads in Durham and Northumberland with proportions like that found at St. John's Cross in Iona Argyll or Lastingham in East Yorkshire. St. John's has an arm span of over 7 feet, and Lastingham measures in at nearly 5 feet, making it the widest known arm span in northern England, with what surely would have been a very substantial cross shaft to match. That said, Lastingham's unfinished, or else defaced back, which you can see on the slide with Jane Hawks holding up a light. Its unfinished or defaced back might reflect a sculptor realizing a design flaw, namely a cross which fell down, which was around the same time being worked through on Iona by the creation of the ringed-headed cross. At Lastingham, the cross might then have been placed against an interior wall rather than being freestanding, as Cramp has argued for some early examples at Jarrow and Hexham. In Britain, however, our surviving evidence shows that the widest high cross arm spans are pretty much contained to Argyll. I'm thinking here to the ringed Kildalton cross, also on the slide, at 4.3 feet, which has been stylistically and iconographically linked to the Iona assemblage. But back to our region. Note too the relative absence of figural motifs. Yes, Durham and Hart's Agnus Dei and Rothbury's Crucified Christ prove exceptions, but the other crossheads on this slide are decidedly non-figural. Now, evidently I'm speaking to surviving fragments, an impartial picture at best, but this slide makes known the relative paucity of figural carving on high crosses in the region. It would be unsurprising if figural elements of a cross were indeed targeted by iconoclasts, which leads us to ask questions like, if a cross was to have figural elements, where on the cross would they have been, head, shaft, or base? Certainly the high survival rate of cross shafts in this region, when compared with cross heads or bases, might be on account of there being places of non-figural carving, although I can certainly think of exceptions to this idea. So too, a lot of what survives comes down to us because it has been reused as architectural masonry, and the shape of a cross shaft is evidently easier to work into a structure than heads or bases. But I digress. Cross bases are similarly varied, albeit they are quite rare survivals in Durham and Northumberland, let alone Britain at large. I include them here only to give you a bit of an idea of what we're working with, although the data set is so small that it's rather difficult to make meaningful regional comparisons, which is why my PhD is transnational or Britain-wide. Now that we know a bit about what our regional high crosses look like, let's take a look at where we find them in assemblages. An archaeological assemblage is defined as a group of artifacts, in this case, high cross fragments. This slide shows 2 graphs comparing sites with assemblages of 5 or more high cross fragments in Durham and Northumberland, with the region to our west, Cumberland, Westmoreland, and Lancashire north of the Sands. What's immediately noticeable is that our remit, Durham and Northumberland, has over double the number of sites which fit this category. Moreover, half of these sites have more high cross fragments than any single site directly to the west. The colors on the bar chart refer to the nature of the fragments. Blue indicates fragments from data sets 1 and 2. These are arbitrary data sets that I've had to make up for my PhD. This is what happens when you work with literally 2,500 fragments and you're trying to keep them straight in your brain. These are, this first data set, the blue one, are without much doubt certainly high cross fragments. The red refers to another data set, lost certain high cross fragments. And the green encompasses all fragments for which it is really uncertain whether or not they come from high crosses. It's my problematic data set. Well, the most problematic data set are the lost uncertain fragments, which is why I've left them out of this chart completely. A small graphic is included in the upper right corner with red dots indicating high cross sites in Durham and Northumberland, and yellow dots indicating high cross sites in Cumberland, Westmoreland, and Lancashire north of the Sands. And I know it's barely legible, but it's there just to give you an idea of the geographic positioning of the areas I'm talking about, and to again remember the greater context on this island. Lindisfarne evidently looms large in any sculpture studies of the region, and for good reason. As you saw in the prior graphic, the site boasts more high cross fragments than any other site in southeast Scotland, Durham, Northumberland, and Cumbria. I'm presuming most of you are familiar with the island, but if you're not, here's my summary. Lindisfarne was home to a very significant early medieval monastery founded by monks from Iona on the west coast of Scotland. One of its most famous inhabitants was St. Cuthbert, for whom Durham Cathedral was later erected, and the island produced one of the finest early medieval manuscripts of all time, the Lindisfarne Gospels. In popular culture and history television shows, Lindisfarne is perhaps best known for the Viking raids it endured, beginning in AD 793. But those were arguably not the most important part of Lindisfarne's story. The image on this slide is of a recent picture from Durham University's excavations on Lindisfarne, led by David Petts in conjunction with the Dig Ventures team. And yes, we were all out there, but definitely masked up this year. So for context, my back is to the east face of the Norman Priory as I took this image. The mound of rock you see in the background is 16th century Lindisfarne Castle, erected to look out for Dutch raiders up and down the Northumbrian coast. The dig brings in undergrads and postgrads, as those of you who listened to David in his lecture will know, as well as very interested and engaged community members of all ages, from age 8 to 80. And after excavating with the team for 4 years, I had the thrill of unearthing a small spica, a coin, this past summer. Before that, all that I had found was later medieval nails and a bit of colored glass from the windows of the priory. I can't say those are bad things to find, though. But most of our work is within a graveyard, and we turn up lots of interesting human remains from the early medieval period. Recent published papers by Victoria Thompson and David Petts have examined the Lindisfarne assemblage in particular, with Thompson giving a reappraisal of the island monastery's relationship to nearby Norham, vis-a-vis Chesterley Street. Thompson in particular gives an interesting argument as to the multifocal nature of the community of Cuthbert, with the two sites, Lindisfarne and Norham, perhaps being complementary to one another and investing in sculpture at different periods of time. To this end, I won't go into great detail other than to point out some key takeaways and also to encourage you to read their papers. We have here a GIS map showing Lindisfarne's coastal location. It's a very memorable shaped island with a long causeway facing towards the shore. I've circled the rough area, which we can consider to be Lindisfarne's hinterland, an area which has about a 30-mile radius. A better image is included on a small inset to the right. As David says when he gives a tour of the island, Lindisfarne's monastic holdings were just about everything you could see from the island as you look to the shore, a rather substantial hinterland for a very wealthy early medieval monastery. And this area today is often referred to as Islandshire. Within this remit, we have only one site producing sculpture at any time during the early medieval period, and that's Inner Farne, here labeled as Great Farne Island, with its single high cross shaft fragment. The Farnes were very much tied to the island, not the least because Cuthbert went off to live on them until the time of his death. This is in contrast to Iona, where we get sculpture, indeed freestanding crosses, being produced in its hinterland. As David has noted, even Port Mahomet, that great Pictish monastery on the Tarbert Peninsula up in northeast Scotland, has a monumental tradition, albeit not freestanding high crosses, which seeps out from its ecclesiastical center in the form of massively impressive, quite literally, Class II Pictish cross slabs, including examples at Shandwick, Nig, and the Hilton of Cadboll. Are we witnessing a different sort of monumental tradition or lack thereof at work here? David has posited that this has something to do with the direct intervisibility of Lindisfarne's monastic core to its dependencies, and I would certainly agree. You can literally see the dependencies from the monastery's shore. This can be compared with the dispersed island landscape of Iona, with its links to other Hebridean islands, Cole, Tiree, Mull, and the Ardnamurchan Peninsula, and a lack of direct visual line to many of these ecclesiastical holdings. Lindisfarne's monumental strategy is indeed intriguing. This slide and the subsequent ones compare the chronology of high crosses at the aforementioned graph sites with high cross assemblages of 5 or more fragments. I realize that dating can be iffy, particularly when we rest on stylistic comparison, and that many monuments in central Britain are being pushed to later dates by scholars like Victoria Thompson. But at least this gives a sense of chronological distribution, or at least highlights gaps in investment. The date ranges have a bit of overlap as accords with cast dating, and I particularly note the timeframes that read 7th/8th to 9th century or 9th/10th to 11th century. This just means that a fragment's creation might well span anywhere within that time frame. And yes, I do realize that means plus or minus 200 years, but that's sometimes what we're working with. But again, this is a useful exercise for examining periods of economic and social investment in sculpture, and not just any sculpture, high crosses. What's immediately significant, and if you take away anything from this rather drab-looking slide, is that the Viking raids of the late 8th and 9th century do not stop the production of sculpture on Lindisfarne. Just look at how the tempo of production increases sometime between the 9th and 10th centuries. Note too the relative absence of high cross production in the earlier period. The possibly earliest Lindisfarne piece, Lindisfarne 10, is a fragment which might be from a high cross according to Cramp, but after looking at literally every other extant high cross fragment in the region, I'm tempted to say it's not. As a result, Lindisfarne doesn't really engage in the tradition of erecting freestanding crosses until the 9th century. That is, during the very century that the textual accounts would have us believe that continued Viking raids stopped ecclesiastical activity on the island. Now, this is not to say that Lindisfarne wasn't producing any sort of sculpture in the earlier pre-Viking period. Indeed, quite the opposite. These slides show some of the recent sculpture finds on the island, name stones. Note that these small monuments, only about 1 to 1.5 feet in length, are inscribed with the names of the deceased. The relatively unworn nature of many of these carvings, and see here the glorious interlace on that springing of the curve on the fragment in the middle of the slide. The unworn nature of these carvings would indicate that they didn't spend much time outdoors and could have been buried in the ground with the deceased, or at least laid to rest on the surface of the ground until a certain time had passed. You can make out the second part of the name N-Vulf, V-U-L-F, on the fragment to the left. It's just a piece of a bigger cross-incised slab. This is the lower right-hand quadrant of it. The cross base is visible as a half semicircle infilled with interlace. I'm particularly taken with this little fragment because when I held it in better light this past summer, I was able to make out 2 parallel lines below the second line of text. I hope you can see them on your slide. It's as if the piece was either A, left unfinished, this space was ruled out in preparation for another line of text to be added, or B, this segment of the inscription was painted rather than carved. These namestones aren't peripheral to our discussion of high crosses. Not only are they the output of the island community prior to the 9th century, but they are, at their heart, stone crosses. I've assembled here a couple of fairly contemporary, that is 8th century artifacts, from which our Lindisfarne namestones might have derived their design, not the least the famous cross carpet folios of the Lindisfarne Gospels produced on the island itself. Manuscript illumination from a regula of St. Benedict from Bavaria mimics the layout of our namestones, linear text interspersed on either side of the cross. We even see here the roundels marking out the arms, center of the cross, and base. Another Lindisfarne namestone from the previous slide has a central recessed roundel, which likely would have held an inset of some sort. The beautiful so-called Rupertus cross, an early medieval processional cross, which found its way to Salzburg, where a monk of Iona set up a community, certainly translates this into another medium. Our high crosses were part of this wider ecclesiastical visual world in which crosses, especially non-figural crosses, were imaged everywhere. This slide brings us back to the production of high crosses on Lindisfarne. I've made this little chronological chart to assign visuals to the simple bar chart we saw earlier. Again, to reiterate, the tempo of high cross production increases from the 9th century on, although we do see a possibly pre-9th century burst of activity, and that's the orange zone. Included in this are 2 important cross spaces, which will rear their head again later in the presentation. There is a noticeable lack of figural carving across time, even during the, quote, Viking period, save for Lindisfarne III's Maestas Domini scene, a seated Christ in a roundel surrounded by what appears to be the 4 evangelists with books or scrolls. This dearth of figuration would accord with what we see in large high cross assemblages just north of here, along the coast at Abercorn. And it's there that I've noted how much key pattern dominates. I can think of no other site in Britain with that many high crosses with key pattern. It's something like 4 cross shafts and 1 cross base. Key pattern is a type of geometric pattern that in Britain predominates in the Pictish heartland and is the expertise of Dr. Cynthia Thickpenny of Glasgow Uni. Interestingly, Lindisfarne 2 has key pattern. Note Lindisfarne 5, very small image on that slide, which would seem to form visual links with sites further north. One wonders if Lindisfarne's outburst of sculptural activity is associated with the regrouping or rebranding of the monastery by the 10th century. Though some monks might have moved with the remains of Cuthbert, indeed they did, and travel about northern England and southern Scotland before settling in Durham, others remained here on the island. This peak of investment in the 9th century is something we also see at Abercorn, an ecclesiastical community similarly reorganized, although at a date slightly earlier in the 8th century after the Battle of Dunnectan. At Abercorn, I would argue we see the community consciously choosing freestanding crosses. After all, these monuments are a relatively new form to the region, and the community at Abercorn chooses to invest in them as an active political statement, through this forging links with their southern neighbors through form, the cross, and indeed with communities right across the Firth of Forth through design. On this slide, we have some chronological distributions again, and I just wanted in passing to remark on the comparative scarcity of high cross production at Hexham and Jarrow. This would in some ways undermine what Cramp has long argued, that these centers plus Wearmouth were integral to the development of the high cross as a sculpture form. Sure, we have initial investment at Hexham, in particular in the 7th and 8th centuries, but then they're silent until the end of our period. Wearmouth has one cross arm plus 2 questionable fragments, neither of which I'm convinced are from high crosses. Durham is also circled in orange to show the almost simultaneous investment that goes into commissioning and producing high crosses when the community of Cuthbert settled on the peninsula in the late 10th century. It would be unsurprising if high crosses are by this time in vogue and the Durham community is reading the signs or the stones of the times. And before we move on, and for the sake of completeness, here's a look at the chronological distributions of the last of our assemblage sites in Durham and Northumberland. These sites have the least number of high cross fragments, and you'll notice that the charts have gone from most to least following the initial bar graph that you'd seen comparing fragment numbers amongst all the sites. Now that you've probably seen more bar graphs than you probably ever wanted to, let's turn to look at the role of these monumental stone crosses. Graphs are lovely and all, but they're meaningless if we don't attach some function to the fragments they're graphically representing. Early medieval texts themselves offer only a handful of tantalizing glimpses into the function and role of high crosses, although many mentioned are of wood and not stone. The most famous of these references include Adamnan's description of the Iona assemblage in the Vita Cuthberti, and Bede's Historia Ecclesiastica's accounts of the place and function of King Oswald's wooden cross at Havenfield. Bede's Vita Cuthberti speaks of Cuthbert asking his monks at Lindisfarne to, quote, bury me in this dwelling near my oratory towards the south on the eastern side of the Holy Cross which I have erected there, end quote. Felix, an East Anglian monk who died in the year 700, writes in his Vita Guthlaki about a cross standing outside the door of Guthlak's parents' house. In the 8th century Hodiaporicon of St. Willibald, compiled by Huneberg, an Anglo-Saxon nun from Bavaria, mentions a cross standing on the estate of the saint's father. Further references to freestanding crosses are included in central and later medieval hagiography and histories. Simeon of Durham, who writes after 1129, a Jarrow and later Durham monk, makes 2 specific references to crosses. One reference is in his Libellus, which describes the journeys of the Lindisfarne community. Simeon records that the community carried Bishop Ethelwald's cross as they traveled throughout the countryside before setting it up on the Durham Peninsula. Victoria Thompson has, however, convincingly thrown the veracity of this reference into question and instead sees it as part of the in-house legend making for the community of Cuthbert. This, of course, does not take away from the intimate linking of body and cross during the peregrination, not the least by Cuthbert's pectoral cross. Nor does it, as Thompson points out, undermine the fact that there was surely a cross in Durham's monastic cemetery by the early 12th century when Simeon writes. Moreover, the so-called St. Oswald's cross, also known as Durham I, for which it is notoriously difficult to assign a date, might be of more ancient extraction, possibly late 9th or 10th century, and thus could have been part of the mythologizing. However, even if that cross shaft is only a revival of an earlier style, merely a commemorative copy of earlier monuments, it still points to the power invested in these objects and to the active role which monuments took in the production of communal memory. These are, after all, inherently public monuments meant to be seen. Only about 9% of high cross fragments in County Durham and Northumberland have actually been found in excavation, but even this low percentage is greater than that that we find in Northwest England. This leaves the majority of high crosses found through reuse, our last topic for today. I want to go through a couple of examples of high crosses believed to be in situ and explore the various roles monuments like this took in the early Middle Ages. Our first examples illustrate the idea of high crosses as boundary markers. Bolum 1, known locally in Durham as the Legs Cross, seems to be in its original position and base and is situated alongside a Roman road north from Piercebridge. This marks it out as a likely boundary cross, as we see in other areas of Britain whereby monuments delineate routeways, proto-parish boundaries, or secular estates. And a classic example of this, which also has Roman routeway links, is the Bearkin Cross near Paisley in southwest Scotland. The square dimensions of Bolum's shaft would likely point to an earlier date for the cross, perhaps 9th century. Cramp once posited that the cross marked the bounds of a secular estate, although I've not been able to find later documentary evidence to support the idea. Certainly, we do know of high crosses on secular estates, and indeed we have evidence in southeast Scotland for secular patronage, Here I'm thinking of a rather worn cross arm from Gullen on the southern shore of the Firth of Forth, where place name evidence establishes a connection between Gullen and the nearby royal manor of Eldbottle. That bottle, second element of the place name, can be translated to something like early hall or house in Old English. Yorkshire evidently provides countless other examples of secular patronage when we get into the world of Viking Age sculpture and iconography, which so abounds in that county. A second example is the cross shaft at Tynemouth, moved to its current location beside the Priory ruins sometime post the 18th century. Tynemouth was an important 7th century monastery built on a headland, like other Northumbrian monasteries up and down this coast, Coldingham and Aldhame included in southeast Scotland. The cross was first mentioned in 1775 as standing in a field 2 miles northwest of Tynemouth, although it was moved twice from that location before it settled to a spot near the Priory. Antiquaries were quick to highlight textual evidence from a manuscript in Bamborough Castle, which refers to a cross at Tynemouth, presumably this one, as the Rod Stone Moor or Cross Flat. These references are supposedly from the late 13th century reign of Edward II. When it was in its original location, the landscape context of the Tynemouth cross likely indicates that it marked out the limits of the monastic territory. A third, albeit later, example of a possible boundary marker is the headless cross shaft from Oldham, now part of the garden of a private house in Northumberland, although its early medieval or pre-Norman date, 11th century question mark, is a bit tenuous. In this regard, it's similar to Kirkhow, also imaged here, although that crosshead with an affixed shaft was reused as a gatepost at some point in its life. Simple crosses like these seem to be related to a tradition which we see in the North York moors, whereby crosses were set up to delineate boundaries. Dinsdale is also on the slide, as it's believed to be in situ. The use of high crosses as boundary markers ties in with the idea of a single monument at a site. Strikingly, all but 3 examples of sites with a single high cross fragment, that is, a high cross fragment that isn't part of an assemblage of other high cross fragments or other sculpture forms, all but 3 of these sites are in Northumberland. As this map shows, our Durham outliers are Winston-on-Tees, Bolham, and Gateshead, though the Gateshead fragment is now lost. This distribution is parallel to England's northwest, where a similar pattern of single high crosses is clustered at the north. And again, we have a very noticeable coastland arrangement with a gap in the upland areas. One wonders how and in what way this is connected to the nearby Scottish distributions, as again there we have many high crosses as the sole sculpture fragment from their site. Now I know that Scotland also has some remarkable high cross assemblages, not the least St. Andrews, Hotham, Iona. And that doesn't even begin to include the equally intriguing assemblages of upright relief cross slabs, which we can see in some ways as high cross hybrids on account of the quite high relief on many of the monuments in Pickland. Lindisfarne illumines further uses for high crosses. Lindisfarne 21, the massive unornamented cross base you've already seen once before, though now with David Petts for scale, is positioned axially between the Norman Priory and the parish church of St. Mary the Virgin. Remains of an earlier late Anglo-Saxon church are visible at St. Mary's in the chancel wall and arch. David and others have in recent years undertaken survey, including GPR, of the Priory and similarly found earlier foundations. This would point to earlier structures aligned on this same axis. Indeed, our cross base, very likely 8th or 9th century itself, fossilizes this older alignment. One can envision this massive cross base along a processional routeway between structures. Certainly the location of another cross base out on the Hyff, excuse my pronunciation, any folks from Northumberland, indicates that these monuments were meant to be seen, and in some cases seen from quite a distance away. The Hyff is a rocky promontory formed by dolerite, running east to west across the southern edge of Holy Island. A recent cross shaft fragment was discovered from excavations up on the Hyff, the inset image, albeit it was found in a grave, which gives us a nice terminus antiquem for the cross's production. One can postulate whether the outlines of coastal high crosses indeed acted as navigational aids or beacons, especially in the haze, and we do have these reference to a watchtower, which was probably out on the Hyff. Almost definitely the silhouettes of these monuments indicated the approach into sacred space, whether by land or sea, and in some ways the approach might begin as soon as the cross was in sight. One literally approached in the cross's shadow. I've also included a black and white photo of another cross base, Lindisfarne 19, and I rather like black and white photos as they're sometimes easier to pick out details from, though nowhere near as good as the late Ian Scott's drawings. The slightly weathered base was found sometime before 1924, probably in excavations by C.R. Pierce. In his Inscribed and Sculptured Stones of Lindisfarne, published in 1925, Pierce says that the base was found in two halves, one close to the northwest pier of the crossing, that is the Priory crossing, and the other in a corresponding position near the southwest pier. He also notes a seemingly large socketed cross base supposedly found in situ under the northwest pier of the crossing, although that has since been covered over and probably still remains under the ground. But back to our base, Lindisfarne 19. Rosemary Cramp puts this base as the last quarter of the 8th to mid-9th century, although I feel more comfortable with the later section of that period, owing to the socket dimensions up top. There are no similar bases in the region, and the only base at all stylistically similar is one that Cramp has pointed out at Hornby, Lancashire, and dated late 8th or early 9th century. In my opinion, there is little in common with that pyramid-shaped base, given that its design consists of 4 faces carved with columns, atop which an arch springs, but that's inconsequential. The lovely curvilinear carvings on the sandstone base give the impression of a cloth draped over the stone. The double lines of the border twist at the top to make a tassel-like shape which hangs down, nearly meeting up with the similarly twisted tassel at the bottom. It's as if the carving axe is binding on the stone. Now, we can come up with all sorts of symbolic reasons for this. I'd like to think there's some sort of interplay between the world of the interior and the world of the exterior. The cross presumably sat out with the church building. So in this way, the sculptured tassels hold up the stone cross like an altar covering would be the object upon which a portable metal or wood altar cross would sit upon the Eucharistic table. So in all, we're seeing that high crosses are dynamic objects, always in conversation with the landscapes of which they are a part and indeed shaped from. This slide includes images of some dynamic high crosses. On the left, we have the beautiful Aberlady cross shaft, now homed in the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh. Alice Blackwell has shown that the drilled eye sockets of the figures have tin inlay, which would have held decorative stone or glass. In candlelight or the changing of light outdoors, the phenomenological effect on the eyes would be similar to Inset in the eyes of the famous early 10th century bust of Saint Foy from Conques in Auvergne, France. That is, the eyes might look almost animate as light bounced off them. So too, examples like St. Martin's Cross in Iona, still outside and bearing up against the Hebridean gales, provide evidence of vertical open-ended slots on the ends of the arms, where ornamental panels might be attached, or else wood or metal arm extensions. These were surely associated with the changes of the liturgical year, whereby ritual procession took place along the so-called Street of the Dead, itself lined with high crosses. Adrian Maldonado and Ewan Campbell at Glasgow University have written recently on this, examining the ways in which Iona served as a, quote, New Jerusalem at the ends of the earth. High crosses were undoubtedly a key feature of this ritual making, programming liturgical movement and physically shaping routeways within the monastic environs. And lastly, heading down to the West Midlands, we have a lovely cross shaft fragment from Tenbury Wells in Worcestershire. The fragment holds a recessed panel, which you can see on this image, within which there is a smaller, deeper vertical slot. A removable panel could have covered a relic held in this slot, which could then have been removed on the saint's feast day or during festivals. Conversely, a relic might have been kept in its own shrine and then transferred to the cross on important days. Jane Hawkes has noted similar holes on the west base of the North Cross at Sandbach in Cheshire. So in all, we're seeing that high crosses are dynamic objects, facilitating visceral engagement, guiding movement, and acting as integral parts of liturgy and communal activity. High crosses are also imaged in other media. This slide includes some arguable high cross skeuomorphs in stone from Durham and Northumberland, since after all, that is our region of focus tonight. I just want to point out a couple of examples, as this could be a paper on its own. An about 2-foot slab from Escombe in the upper left-hand corner of your screen, stylistically dated to the late 8th or early 9th century, images what might be a high cross, notes the base upon which the cross shaft sits. The spheres hanging down from either side of the collar might be read as reeds, in a manner similar to some late antique Italian sarcophagi, which utilized the symbol with the cross. The equal-armed crosshead on this fragment certainly calls to mind freestanding crossheads in our region. Moreover, if this fragment is related to another found at Escombe 4, it might have made up an altar siding. Just as the Lindisfarne cross base, with its cloth-like ornament, wraps itself in the vestments of liturgy or the drapery of the imagined Old Testament temple, this stone slab brings the monumental indoors and literally has it wrapping the Eucharistic liturgy, which unfolds. The curved tops of the Lindisfarne namestones, including Lindisfarne 29 to the bottom right of your screen, similarly set their cross within an enclosed, one might argue, architectural space. On Lindisfarne 29, the incised cross indeed becomes part of that architecture, in that the interlace of its base is worked into the border design. Durham 12, a much thinner but longer, about 3 foot in length slab, likely used as a grave cover, depicts a deeply carved crosshead, type B, 11 if we use corpus terminology, with an affixed shaft. What appears to be evangelist symbols are located within 3 of the surviving arm terminals, and a figure with wings and a tapering body is below. Its arms appear to be raised as if in orange posture, a posture of prayer. Evangelist symbols are known on crossheads, as at Russell and Dumfries and Galloway, and in the Durham assemblage itself. Lastly, a grave slab from Auckland St. Andrew also makes clear that it could be imaging a high cross that's located in the bottom center of your screen, given its cross base so decidedly carved at the foot of the fragment. In this way, high crosses, those upstanding display monuments in the land of the living, are now being translated into the world of the dead, indeed even sealing the grave. These carved crosses can pictorially carry on the liturgy, even when it has ceased. I'll end tonight as promised with a brief look at reuse contexts. After all, it's because of fragmentation and reuse that these monuments have survived and are here for us to study. I also want this to be a reminder that things are very fragmented, lest you've got the idea that they're all pretty crosses. For the sake of time, I'll just look at a couple of key examples, as we could otherwise go on forever with the chronology of reuse. St. Oswald and Lee offers an interesting first case study in reuse, a Roman altar reused as an early medieval cross base. Yes, a wooden cross might have been inserted into the socket, but it doesn't seem completely unlikely that a monumental stone cross might have also been affixed. And this is backed up by the fact that there's vine scroll carved onto the bottom of the base, and that's a very common motif in early high cross carving. Cliff 8 gives us a double reuse context. The fragment was found itself reused as building material in the walls of St. Andrew's Church. It appears to have previously been used as a piscina, a liturgical basin with a drain, prior to its being incorporated into the church masonry. 2 different 10th century Sockburn cross shaft fragments were found built into the foundations of the pre-Norman chancel at All Saints Church. Building high cross components into later building foundations is not uncommon, as we see this in other areas of Britain. But this is also important because it's showing us that reuse isn't just for things to be seen. There's also a rather important message being sent when something is either intentionally or seemingly carelessly hidden or disregarded. At the beginning, I promised a comparison with high cross reuse in Northwest England. So here's some examples to our west. There's a lot more variety to how high cross fragments are reused in Northwest England than in the Northeast. And as you'll see here, high cross fragments in Cumberland tend to get reused in pairs or trios or quads in this region. Bromfield 1 and 2, a crosshead and seemingly unrelated cross shaft, were found in the churchyard at St. Kentigern's Church, Bromfield. They were located beneath a stone platform, which had served as the base of a later medieval cross, indicating that they might have been intentionally buried at the time of that cross's erection. A burying of older memory, perhaps, or maybe this is a consecration of the new cross by putting some now centuries-old fragments underneath it. 3 now lost fragments from St. Bees in Cumberland, hence the drawings rather than actual photos, were in the mid-19th century discovered in Norman walling in the Church of St. Bega. And at Workington, a site which has undergone recent excavations post a fire at the church in 1994, we have a couple more case studies, plus more sculpture found after the publication of Volume 1 in the Corpus of Anglo-Saxon Stone Sculpture. The fragments on this slide are some of the pieces found in 1926 while digging a tunnel into the Kerwin family burial vault located beneath the church. There seems to be a clear effort to forge a link with the Christian past at the site through the inclusion of these early medieval monuments in an early modern and indeed later burial site. Now, I know that we've covered a lot of ground tonight, so thanks for staying with me if you are indeed still there on the other side of Zoom. I'd like to close with this probably late 7th or early 8th century inscribed relief slab from Jarrow and let it have the last word. But before that, I'd like to end with a reflection on the high cross as a form. High crosses were a monumental sculpture. They were freestanding, body-sized or larger monuments. They were meant to be engaged with and to be viewed repetitively. And they also shape into stone the most important symbol of the Christian faith, the cross, that vehicle of salvific promise. So while at the beginning I said that high crosses aren't just crosses, their cruciform shape can never be forgotten. Each sign points to the sign. And now for the inscription surrounding the Jarrow relief cross. In hoc singulare signo vita reditur mundo, which I'll translate as, in this unique sign, life is given back to the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christina. Normally, this would be the situation point where we all applaud. So we'll have to mime and applaud. I still haven't worked out how to coordinate a Mexican wave on Twitter. That's something we need to try and choreograph next time. Thank you ever so much for that. You covered a huge amount of material. There's some really interesting things. There's certainly things there I was thinking, oh, I need to go away and have a ponder about that myself. We've already got some questions in chat, so if anyone else has any questions, please feel free to share them. So I'm going to take the questions in order. First of all, Christina, in very general terms, I'm going to ask you a really difficult question here. Can you just kind of characterize how the designs on the crosses change over time in Cumbria? You said, yeah, I mean, there's hints that they were the biggest ones were the latest ones, but are there any other broad chronological changes?
Not necessarily the biggest. You mean in Cumbria, not in our region?
In our region, sorry, in our region.
Oh, in our region. Okay, yes. In our region, yes. At least the surviving crossheads, the biggest ones, are later. But we do see an increase in figural carving, but that accords with what we see across Britain during the Viking Age, which is why I think a lot of art historians have focused on that period, the figural imagery. So I tend to kind of shy away from the figuration intentionally. We also see new forms and hybrid forms kind of come into the light. So we have different wheel-headed, disc-headed crosses, and each region kind of takes on its own take on that tradition. So, for example, in Cornwall, we see, and I should say that the Cornish crosses are dated on the whole 10th to 11th century. That the tradition only seems to kind of spring up during that later period, and we see crossheads that are not free arms. Instead, they're engaged to a plane, so they would be ring-headed or disc-headed crosses. But there's other changes, and obviously art historians would be able to explain changes in the way in which Christ is represented too.
That leads us nicely onto one of the next questions: is why don't we see images of the crucified Christ on? Brilliant.
I go to bed thinking about this almost every night. This is what got me into studying this topic, honestly. The lack of figuration and what we do with the absence of figural carving, in particular, the absence of Christ. Now, I'll preface this by saying, yes, there are examples of Christ crucified, Christ in majesty, Majestas Domini. So we do have examples of Christ on cross shafts, on cross heads, but for the greater part, we don't have Christ imaged. So I don't have a good answer for that. I'm trying to figure this out within a larger data set, but I certainly think there's something to be said for the iconoclastic kind of strands in the Byzantine world, which are occurring at the same time as the high crosses are being constructed in Britain. So as a bit of background, Bede, writing in 728, 731, has knowledge of Byzantine iconoclasm at its advent. And so he's talking about the fact that there are some who say we can't carve figural images. So one has to wonder, in some way, is there a connection between the dearth of figural carving and emergent Byzantine iconoclasm? That's something I'm trying to kind of piece together in some ways. But one thing I will say to kind of close that is something I've been thinking about is in the lack of a figural carving on the cross privileges the individual who looks at that carving. They become the body upon which, your shadow would, if a cross is outside, would, be imaged on the cross itself. So it's kind of that idea of the community of believers who engage in that. So I'm sorry I don't have a satisfactory question. I wonder too.
So it's always good when you ask a question and the speaker says, yes, that is a very good question, but I don't know the answer. So that's good. Next question. You mentioned in passing the possibility that some of the crosses might have been painted. Do we have evidence for painted crosses or painted Anglo-Saxon early medieval sculpture?
Yes, I'm thinking one of the most beautiful examples is the Lichfield angel. which was in the British Museum's exhibit when Lindisfarne was next to some other really important manuscripts from the north. So yes, there is evidence of painting. And if you look in the corpus volumes, you'll see sometimes pigment is noted, often red pigment comes up a lot. And certainly in the north, in the Pictish heartland, we have examples of painted of sculpture there. And certainly if you're thinking of these objects as being dynamic within their landscape, painting would help certainly figural carving kind of come to the front and stand out more to the eye. So that's something ongoing. Other people are studying that.
I think that's really important, because when we see them now, we see them as kind of stone. But in the you mentioned the inset eyes from Aberlady, and the experience of looking at these things would have been completely different from how we look at them now. They would have been vividly painted. They would have had the Aberlady with the eyes, and you can imagine the little mouse on Jedburgh shrine front with the eyes. We have hints of metal insettings on some of the namestones from Lindisfarne. They would have been much more like those vivid cross pages, cross carpet pages you showed from gospel books. The kind of relationship between the carving and the gospel illustration would have been so much more immediate than it is perhaps for us. I've got a question about stone. Are they made from local stone? Is the stone being brought in from elsewhere? I know there's a lot of variation.
Yes, a lot of variation. The corpus volumes provide good geological summaries at the beginning of them. In this region, most of our stone is sandstone, but you'll see variation across Britain. So for example, in southwest Scotland, we have greywacke, or greywacke, I'm not sure how you say it, which is a type of stone that's quite difficult to carve. So as a result, you see slab-like shafts, which some people have commented kind of looks like debased carving, or, a sculptor who didn't know what he was doing. But on the contrary, it's actually just the difficulty of working with the stone. So we're lucky in this region that we have sandstone, which is much easier to carve. But that would be another PhD to look at outcrops of stone, as has been done at Iona. I think it was Ewan Campbell who was looking at where the sourcing of the Iona crosses would have come from. And I think he was looking at some mainland Argyll sites from which the stone would be transported. So that's a really crucial question. And I think David gets me to think about often that high crosses aren't just there by chance, that they're the result of the landscape around them. And as a result, just because we don't see a high percentage of high crosses in the south, it might also just be on account of the lack of workable stone. So that's a really important question.
It's worth just flagging up here. This is where Paul is going to make his debut as an early medievalist, because the cross fragments from Frosterley, from St. Botolph's, now that stone isn't local, is it? That stone's coming in from Sunderland. Is that right?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I just unmuted myself. Yeah, I'm tempted to go and get it from behind my sofa. It's just over there, showing everybody the centre of it. As I understand it, I'll never be an early medievalist, but it's Roca dolomite, and Roca dolomite is only found at Roca, which is Wearmouth. So little old Frosterley, halfway up Weardale, is linked directly in some way with Wearmouth in the 8th century, which I find absolutely fascinating. And of course, the St. Botolph's Frosterley cross, albeit fragmentary, was found in excavation, and there are all sorts of interesting things about it. Yeah. And maybe actually that should be another lecture at some point to this audience, because it's absolutely fascinating, as you well know, David.
And there's no, it's not like there's a shortage of stone in Weardale.
Not at all. No.
Exactly.
I mean, the Roca dolomite was used, wasn't it? I mean, you know more about this than me, but the Roca dolomite was used quite a lot because it's quite chalky and it's easily carved. But it's very, very distinctive. And when we were excavating that site, as soon as we saw a bit of the cross, we didn't know it was a bit of cross, but we knew it was an odd bit of stone, very different from anything else that we found on the site. And then when it turned out to be part of an 8th century cross, well, that's why we went back to try and find the rest of it, and we found somewhat bits of it, but not all of it. But I was thinking about that, looking at some of the crosses in this presentation, many of which I'm completely unfamiliar with, but the sort of quite simple basic undecorated cross with a circle in the middle of the cross is that was cropping up again and again and again, and that's of course what we got at St Botolph's. So yeah, Christina, have you had a look at the St Botolph's cross?
Not in any depth, so I've just written down as you were talking.
I've got some photos. I can
or
share.
send you links, or David can. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's definitely, well, it's definitely the most interesting of all the crosses. I can say that. No, it is an interesting one, though, isn't it? And the fact that it was found in an excavation as well.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah.
So we've got a couple more questions, and I think we'll probably have to draw a line after that. So I've got a question from Victoria. Are you looking at the question of composite monuments, so crosses plus a slab, or cross plus a what you would call a hogback, or are you just focusing on?
You mean assemblages with other types of sculpture?
Yeah, where they kind of articulate
or you mean
together.
Right? No. I have enough to work with right now. Would be a brilliant point for further research. The kind of hybrid monuments. I think something I definitely need to look at more. I think the hybrid monument I'll stick to right now are the kind of the Pictish cross slabs, and trying to look at their relationship distribution-wise to the freestanding monuments. Certainly in Pickland, obviously we don't have that tradition of as much of freestanding cruciform stone sculptures, but no, that's an excellent idea, Victoria. I'll write that down too. Another PhD.
Right, I'm just going to choose one or two last questions. I apologise in advance for people whose questions didn't get covered. There's a couple of questions which are kind of all about who are the people who make these crosses. Do we know anything about the carvers? Do we know anything about whether it was people travelling around doing it? Have you got an understanding actually how these crosses were created?
This is something that Megan Caston and others at Glasgow are looking into by kind of trying to look at the signature of a certain kind of interlace or ornament, and trying to figure out if you can see kind of connections between monuments. So one way to view this would be kind of, are there schools of carvers that travel about a region? I think the general idea, though, is that our earliest high crosses, because they're uniformly pretty much associated with monastic houses, that they would have probably had their own sculptors in-house, since we know that they were centers of artistic production and manuscripts, metalwork, all sorts of other medium. So we certainly see that in the early period, but I think as we head into the 9th, 10th centuries, it wouldn't be unlikely to have kind of more traveling schools of sculptors. And as I said, that's something that is being looked at with regards to the Govan School in southwest Scotland and some other regions in the UK. That's a really good question.
Okay, right. Oh, I hope people can still. Sorry, my computer is doing something very strange there. So I think we'll draw a line under there. And massive apologies for everyone whose questions I wasn't able to convey. But there's a huge amount to talk about. There's a huge amount to digest for everybody there. So this is the point where we all thank Christina once again for an absolutely fascinating talk. There's so much. I know I'm an early medievalist, so I'm biased, but there's so much here to unpack. There's so much still to be gained from the analysis of this material. Sometimes it's really easy to think that so many of these monuments have been known for a long time that we're kind of running out of questions to ask. But there's so much we can look and so much we can understand from all sorts of different perspectives, thinking about where they are, what they look like, their design, how they sit together as groups and individual sites. And there's lots more questions which we can ask here. And it's great that Christina is actually asking some of these questions. So thank you once again, Christina. That's really, really wonderful. Hopefully we will be, fingers crossed, hopefully we'll find some more sculpture when we're out at Lindisfarne in September when we're excavating. And I should say Christina's been a really important part of the team of the Lindisfarne project, and she's writing up the sculpture we're finding. So we want to try and keep her busy in future seasons. Otherwise, as I said, we will be circulating information about the Holy Wells project on Friday evening. We will be in the next week or two circulating dates for the series of prehistoric talks, and as the wider situation is changing, we will be tightening up some of the arrangements for actual field work as well. So things are really starting to get moving again after a very difficult year. So I'd just like to finish off by thanking you all for attending. It's been great to have such good numbers. this is one of the joys of Zoom, and I think we also spend a lot of time getting square-eyed, but it's great that we can bring so many people together from across the whole region and looking at people, look at names here. There's people I know from literally the whole of the Northeast and well beyond as well. So thank you very much for coming. One last mimed applause for Christina, and then I will end. There you go, it's great. It's like primary school, you get you all to do actions. So thank you very much, Christina. I will speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.